Security footage showed nothing, but Charlotte Wilson's hands were still shaking as she stood in the marble foyer of the Ashford mansion, watching her entire world collapse in real time. Mrs. Victoria. Ashford's diamond bracelet worth $200,000 had vanished from the master bedroom, and somehow every suspicious glance, every whispered conversation, and every cold stare from the household staff had landed squarely on the 23-year-old maid who had been working there for barely 8 months. Charlotte pressed her trembling fingers against the seam of her gray uniform dress, the same one she'd ironed with meticulous care that morning, never imagining it would be the last time she'd wear it in this house. The accusation had come swift and brutal during the staff meeting that morning, delivered by Mrs. Eleanor Hartwell, the sharp-eyed head housekeeper who had never liked Charlotte from the moment she'd arrived seeking work. Mrs. Hartwell's voice had cut through the morning air like broken glass, each word calculated to destroy. Someone in this house is a thief, and I have my suspicions about who it might be. The mansion around her felt different now, transformed from the place where she'd found purpose and stability into a cold monument to her failure. Every pristine surface she'd polished, every Persian rug she'd vacuumed, every crystal chandelier she'd carefully dusted, now seemed to mock her presence. The Ashford estate sprawled across 15 acres of manicured Connecticut countryside, a testament to the kind of generational wealth that Charlotte had only read about in magazines before she'd started working here. Now, standing in its grand entrance hall with her final paycheck clutched in her sweating palm, she felt smaller than she'd ever felt in her life. Mr. Richard Ashford, the billionaire tech mogul whose empire had been built on revolutionary software patents, had barely looked at her during the termination meeting. His attention had remained fixed on his phone screen, occasionally nodding as Mrs. Hartwell recounted the evidence against Charlotte, evidence that consisted entirely of the fact that she'd been cleaning the master bedroom the day before the bracelet disappeared. No one mentioned that half the household staff had access to that room, or that Charlotte had never shown interest in jewelry, or that her references from her previous positions had been impeccable. The injustice burned in Charlotte's chest like acid, but she'd learned long ago that people like her didn't get to defend themselves against people like them. She'd grown up in foster care, bouncing between homes until she'd aged out of the system at 18. And the last 5 years had been a constant struggle to build something resembling stability. This job at the Ashford mansion had been her salvation, not just the decent salary, but the sense of belonging she'd felt when 12-year-old Sophie Ashford had started seeking her out for conversations about everything from homework troubles to friendship drama. Charlotte had always been good with children, perhaps because she remembered what it felt like to be overlooked and dismissed by the adults who were supposed to protect you. Sophie had been different from the rest of her family, curious about Charlotte's life, genuinely interested in her opinions, and delighted by Charlotte's stories about growing up in different foster homes. While Mrs. Ashford treated Charlotte like a piece of furniture, and Mr. Ashford barely acknowledged her existence, Sophie had made Charlotte feel like a real person with thoughts and feelings worth considering. But now, as Charlotte gathered her few personal belongings from the small staff room where she'd kept her sweater and lunch bag, Sophie was at school, blissfully unaware that her favorite member of the household staff was being driven away in disgrace. Charlotte had considered waiting to say goodbye, but Mrs. Hartwell had made it clear that her presence was no longer welcome anywhere on the property. The other staff members avoided eye contact as she passed through the service corridors. Some out of embarrassment, others out of fear that associating with her might cast suspicion on them as well. The truth was, Charlotte had noticed things in recent weeks that had made her uncomfortable, but she'd convinced herself it wasn't her place to speak up. She'd seen Mrs. Patricia Ashford, the billionaire's wife, stumbling through the halls at odd hours, her eyes glassy and unfocused in a way that suggested more than just wine with dinner. She'd witnessed heated phone conversations between Mrs. Ashford and someone she called Vincent, conversations that always ended with Mrs. Ashford looking panicked and desperate. Most troubling of all, Charlotte had twice discovered Mrs. Ashford in the master bedroom at unusual times, frantically searching through jewelry boxes and drawers as if looking for something specific. But pointing fingers at the lady of the house was unthinkable for someone in Charlotte's position. Household staff who made waves didn't just lose their jobs, they lost their references, their reputation, and any hope of finding decent work in the future. So Charlotte had kept her observations to herself, focusing instead on her duties and her friendship with Sophie, hoping that whatever troubles were brewing in the Ashford family would resolve themselves without her involvement. Now, walking down the circular driveway with her small suitcase in hand, Charlotte realized how naive she'd been. In houses like this, when valuable things disappeared, the blame always rolled downhill until it landed on whoever had the least power to defend themselves. She'd been foolish to think that her hard work, her reliability, or even her genuine care for Sophie would protect her when the family needed a scapegoat. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the perfectly manicured lawn as Charlotte waited for the bus that would take her back to her small apartment in Bridgeport. She had enough savings to cover rent for maybe 2 months, and finding another position without a reference from her most recent employer would be nearly impossible. The irony wasn't lost on her that she was losing everything over a bracelet worth more than she'd earned in 3 years. A piece of jewelry that Mrs. Ashford probably hadn't even noticed was missing until someone else pointed it out. As the bus pulled up to the ornate gates of the estate, Charlotte took one last look at the mansion where she'd briefly allowed herself to believe she belonged. The windows of Sophie's room on the 2nd floor reflected the afternoon light like accusatory eyes, and Charlotte felt a sharp pang of regret that she wouldn't be there when the girl came home from school. Sophie would ask questions, and eventually she'd learn that Charlotte had been branded a thief and sent away. The thought of losing Sophie's respect and friendship hurt worse than the job loss itself. The bus doors opened with a mechanical wheeze, and Charlotte stepped aboard, finding a seat near the back where she could disappear among the other passengers heading back to their ordinary lives. As the Ashford estate grew smaller in the rear window, Charlotte made herself a promise. Somehow, some way, she would prove her innocence and clear her name. She owed it to herself, and she owed it to Sophie, who deserved to know that the person she'd trusted hadn't betrayed that trust. The truth had a way of surfacing eventually, even in houses built on secrets and lies, and Charlotte would be ready when it did. The news of Charlotte's dismissal spread through the wealthy Connecticut social circle like wildfire, each retelling adding new embellishments to the story until Charlotte found herself transformed from accused thief to confirmed criminal in the span of 48 hours. Mrs. Victoria Ashford, eager to demonstrate her decisive handling of the theft, had shared the story with her book club, her tennis partners, and her charity board colleagues, each conversation reinforcing the narrative that swift justice had been served and the family's security had been protected. Charlotte discovered the extent of the damage when she arrived at her first job interview since leaving the Ashford mansion. Mrs. Eleanor Pemberton, who had initially seemed enthusiastic about Charlotte's qualifications over the phone, greeted her with cold suspicion and barely concealed disgust. The interview lasted less than 10 minutes, ending when Mrs. Pemberton leaned back in her leather chair and asked, "Is it true that you were terminated from the Ashford estate for theft?" The question hung in the air like a death sentence, and Charlotte's stammered attempts to explain fell on deaf ears. Word had somehow reached the placement agencies as well, and Charlotte found herself quietly removed from their active candidate lists without explanation. The professional cleaning service where she'd worked before joining the Ashford household suddenly had no available positions, despite their recent advertisements for experienced staff. Even the local grocery store, where she'd hoped to find temporary work while searching for another domestic position, seemed reluctant to consider her application once her most recent employer's name appeared on her resume. The isolation was suffocating. Charlotte's small apartment in Bridgeport felt like a prison cell as days passed without any promising leads. She'd never realized how much of her social interaction had centered around her work until she found herself completely cut off from that world. The other domestic workers she'd occasionally met at the market or on their days off seemed to vanish whenever she appeared, afraid that associating with her might damage their own reputations. Meanwhile, back at the Ashford mansion, life continued its predictable rhythm of privilege and routine, but with subtle undercurrents of tension that hadn't existed before Charlotte's departure. Sophie had returned from school that first day expecting to find Charlotte in the kitchen as usual, ready to help with homework and listen to stories about the day's events. Instead, she'd been curtly informed by Mrs. Hartwell that Charlotte no longer worked for the family and would not be returning. The 12-year-old had pressed for details with the persistence that only children possess, but the adults in her life had closed ranks, offering vague explanations about inappropriate behavior and violation of trust that only confused and upset her more. Sophie had always been unusually perceptive for her age, perhaps a result of growing up in a household where adults spoke in careful euphemisms and maintained facades even within the family. She could sense that something important was being hidden from her, and the evasive answers only strengthened her determination to understand what had really happened to Charlotte, Mrs. Patricia. Ashford's behavior had become increasingly erratic since Charlotte's departure, a change that might have been attributed to guilt if anyone had been paying close enough attention. She'd taken to avoiding the master bedroom during daylight hours, claiming it needed deep cleaning after the incident. Her phone calls with the mysterious Vincent had become more frequent and more desperate, often conducted in hushed tones in her private sitting room with the door firmly closed. The missing bracelet, meanwhile, had never been reported to the police, despite its significant value. When Sophie had innocently asked why they hadn't involved the authorities if something so expensive had been stolen, Mr. Ashford had quickly shut down the conversation, claiming that they preferred to handle family matters privately. This explanation satisfied most of the household, but it struck Sophie as odd that her father, who was normally obsessive about security and protecting his assets, would be so casual about such a substantial theft. Charlotte, unaware of the growing doubts in Sophie's mind, was facing the harsh reality of life as a blacklisted domestic worker. Her savings were depleting faster than expected, and the stress of unemployment was taking its toll on her health and appearance. She'd lost weight she couldn't afford to lose, and the constant anxiety had left dark circles under her eyes that made her look older than her 23 years. The few friends she'd maintained outside of work tried to be supportive, but they struggled to understand the unique challenges she faced. Well-meaning suggestions to just find another job or explain your side of the story revealed how little they knew about the domestic service industry, where reputation was everything and a single accusation could end a career permanently. Charlotte found herself pulling away from these friendships as well, unable to bear their pity or their inability to truly comprehend her situation. Mrs. Hartwell, meanwhile, had taken on additional responsibilities in Charlotte's absence, but her satisfaction at removing what she'd seen as a threat to the household's stability was beginning to sour. The young maid had actually been quite competent at her job, and finding a suitable replacement was proving more difficult than expected. The temporary workers sent by the agency lacked Charlotte's attention to detail and her intuitive understanding of the family's routines. More troubling was Sophie's increasingly sullen behavior. The girl had always been polite and cooperative, but since Charlotte's departure, she'd become withdrawn and defiant. She refused to discuss her homework with Mrs. Hartwell, picked at her meals, and spent most of her free time alone in her room. When her parents attempted to address her attitude, Sophie would only say that she missed someone who actually cared about what I had to say, a comment that stung more than they cared to admit. The household's carefully maintained equilibrium was showing cracks in other ways as well. Mr. Ashford had noticed his wife's increased anxiety and strange behavior, but he attributed it to the stress of dealing with the theft and the disruption to their routine. He'd suggested that Patricia take a vacation or increase her sessions with her therapist, unaware that the source of her distress was far more complicated than simple household drama. Mrs. Patricia Ashford's gambling addiction had been a carefully guarded secret for over 2 years. Funded initially by skimming from her generous household allowance, and later by gradually selling pieces of her extensive jewelry collection. The diamond bracelet had been one of her most valuable pieces, and its absence was part of a larger pattern of missing items that she'd been desperately trying to conceal. Charlotte's termination had bought her time, but it hadn't solved the underlying problem of her mounting debts to Vincent, a private bookie who was becoming increasingly impatient with her payment delays. As the days passed, the weight of the false accusation began to settle into Charlotte's bones like a chronic illness. She'd always prided herself on her integrity and work ethic, qualities that had helped her survive and occasionally thrive despite her difficult circumstances. Now, those very qualities felt like weaknesses. As if her naivety about how the world really worked had made her an easy target for others' deceptions. The approaching weekend brought with it a particularly cruel reminder of what she'd lost. Saturday afternoons had been Charlotte's favorite time at the Ashford mansion, when her regular duties were lighter, and she often found herself helping Sophie with art projects or listening to the girl practice piano. The thought of Sophie spending that time alone, or worse, trying to explain to her school friends why her favorite household staff member had suddenly disappeared, made Charlotte's chest tight with grief and anger. Standing at her apartment window, looking out at the gray October sky, Charlotte made a decision that surprised her with its clarity. She couldn't afford to hire a lawyer or conduct a formal investigation, but she could start asking questions and gathering information on her own. Someone in that house knew the truth about the missing bracelet, and Charlotte was determined to find out who it was, even if it meant putting herself at risk. She owed it to herself, to Sophie, and to every other domestic worker who might face similar accusations in the future. Charlotte's unofficial investigation started with the one advantage she had over any outside investigator. She knew the intimate rhythms and hidden spaces of the Ashford mansion. 8 months of working there had given her insights into the family's habits, the staff's relationships, and the physical layout of the house that no amount of formal questioning could provide. Armed with nothing but determination and her detailed knowledge of the household, she began to piece together a timeline of events surrounding the bracelet's disappearance. Her first breakthrough came from an unexpected source: Maria Santos, a weekend cleaner who worked for several wealthy families in the area. Charlotte had known Maria peripherally from their occasional overlaps at the mansion, and unlike the regular staff, Maria wasn't dependent on the Ashfords for her primary income. When Charlotte approached her at the bus stop, they both used. Maria was initially hesitant, but eventually agreed to meet for coffee to discuss what she'd observed. Maria's account painted a troubling picture of the days leading up to Charlotte's termination. She'd noticed Mrs. Patricia Ashford's increasing agitation during her previous 3 visits to the mansion, particularly her tendency to spend long periods in the master bedroom with the door closed. On 2 occasions, Maria had heard Mrs. Ashford on phone calls that seemed to involve financial discussions, with phrases like, "I need more time," and "the payment will be late," filtering through the closed door. More significantly, Maria revealed that she'd seen Mrs. Ashford examining jewelry in the master bedroom on the morning before the bracelet was reported missing, and that the lady of the house had seemed surprised and disturbed when Maria knocked to request cleaning supplies. Mrs. Ashford had quickly closed a jewelry box and left the room, claiming she had urgent errands to run. But not before Maria noticed her putting something small into her purse. This information aligned with Charlotte's own observations about Mrs. Ashford's behavior, but it also raised new questions about the timeline of the theft. If Mrs. Ashford had been handling jewelry the morning before it was reported missing, why had the accusation been directed at Charlotte, who had cleaned the room the previous day? The timing suggested either a deliberate attempt to frame Charlotte or a confused understanding of when the bracelet had actually disappeared. Charlotte's next step was to research Mrs. Ashford's recent activities and financial situation. Using the public information available about the family's social engagements and business dealings, what she discovered was a pattern of behavior that suggested someone under significant financial pressure. Mrs. Ashford had attended several high-stakes charity auctions in recent months, participating aggressively in bidding wars for items she'd later resold through private collectors. She'd also increased her involvement in exclusive social clubs that required substantial membership fees and regular financial contributions. The investigation took on new urgency when Charlotte learned that she wasn't the only domestic worker to be accused of theft in the affluent Connecticut community. 3 other women had been terminated under similar circumstances over the past year, all involving valuable jewelry and all resulting in immediate dismissal without police involvement. The pattern suggested either an epidemic of dishonesty among domestic workers, highly unlikely given the rigorous background checks required for such positions, or a systematic use of household staff as scapegoats for other problems. Meanwhile, at the Ashford mansion, Sophie was conducting her own investigation with the single-minded determination that only children possess when they believe an injustice has been committed. Unlike Charlotte, Sophie had unlimited access to the house and the family's private spaces, advantages she was beginning to use more strategically than her parents realized. Her hurt and confusion over Charlotte's sudden departure had evolved into anger at what she increasingly was unfair treatment. Sophie's investigation began with a systematic search of areas where the bracelet might have been dropped or forgotten, but it quickly expanded into a broader examination of her mother's behavior and daily routines. The 12-year-old had always been observant, but her new focus revealed patterns that had previously escaped her notice. Her mother's phone calls had become more secretive, often conducted in whispered tones with frequent references to meetings and appointments that never appeared on the family calendar. More troubling was her mother's reaction to questions about Charlotte's dismissal. Mrs. Ashford became defensive and agitated whenever Sophie mentioned the former maid, insisting that the matter was closed and that Sophie needed to move on from her attachment to household staff. This response struck Sophie as strange, since her mother had never objected to her friendship with Charlotte before and had actually seemed pleased that Sophie had found someone to talk to about school and personal problems. The breakthrough in Sophie's investigation came when she discovered her mother's hidden phone during a search of the master bedroom that she'd conducted while her parents were attending a business dinner. The device was tucked behind books in her mother's private study, and its recent call history revealed dozens of conversations with someone listed only as V. The text messages were even more revealing, showing a pattern of increasingly desperate requests for more time and promises to have the money soon. Sophie's discovery of the hidden phone coincided with Charlotte's own progress in understanding the broader context of the Ashford family's financial situation. Public records showed that while Mr. Ashford's business empire remained strong, Mrs. Ashford had recently borrowed against several pieces of real estate and had liquidated multiple investment accounts. The pattern suggested someone with access to significant assets who was nevertheless facing immediate cash flow problems, exactly the situation that might drive someone to sell valuable jewelry and then blame the theft on convenient scapegoats. The weight of her discoveries was beginning to affect Sophie's behavior in ways that her parents couldn't ignore. She'd become moody and withdrawn, snapping at her mother during casual conversations and asking pointed questions about family finances that made both parents uncomfortable. When Mr. Ashford asked about her change in attitude, Sophie gave evasive answers that left him feeling like he was missing crucial information about his own household. Mrs. Ashford's stress levels had reached a breaking point as her debts to Vincent continued to mount and her ability to generate quick cash became increasingly limited. The sale of the diamond bracelet had provided temporary relief, but Vincent's demands were escalating, and she was running out of valuable items that could be sold without immediate detection. Her relationship with her daughter had become strained as Sophie's questions grew more specific and harder to deflect. And she began to suspect that the girl knew more than she was revealing. Charlotte, meanwhile, had reached the limits of what she could discover through public records and casual conversations with former colleagues. Her investigation had provided strong circumstantial evidence that Mrs. Ashford was involved in the bracelet's disappearance. But she lacked the concrete proof needed to clear her name and restore her reputation. She needed access to information that only someone inside the house could provide. But returning to the mansion grounds would risk arrest for trespassing. The solution came from an unexpected source when Sophie, frustrated by her inability to find definitive proof of her mother's guilt, made a decision that would change everything. Using the contact information from Charlotte's employment file, which she'd accessed through her father's home office computer, Sophie sent a simple text message that would set the final act of the drama into motion. "I know you didn't take the bracelet. I think I know who did. Can you meet me tomorrow after school?" The message reached Charlotte on a gray Thursday afternoon as she sat in her apartment wondering if she should give up her investigation and focus on finding work in another field entirely. Sophie's text felt like a lifeline, but it also represented a dangerous opportunity that could either vindicate her or make her situation significantly worse. The girl was clearly taking a risk by reaching out, and Charlotte knew that meeting with her could be seen as an attempt to manipulate or influence a minor. But the possibility of finally learning the truth was too compelling to ignore, even if it meant putting both herself and Sophie in potentially difficult positions. The abandoned playground behind Bridgeport Elementary School had been Sophie's idea, a location she'd chosen specifically because it was far enough from her usual haunts to avoid accidental discovery by family, friends, or household staff, but public enough to ensure Charlotte's safety. Sophie had arrived 20 minutes early, her stomach churning with nervousness as she considered the magnitude of what she was about to do. At 12 years old, she'd never deliberately deceived her parents about anything significant, but her certainty that Charlotte had been wrongly accused outweighed her discomfort with the deception. Charlotte approached the meeting with equal parts hope and apprehension. Having spent the previous night researching the legal implications of meeting with her former employer's minor child, she'd concluded that as long as their conversation remained focused on clearing her name and didn't involve any attempt to gain access to the Ashford property, she was probably within legal bounds. Still, she knew that if the meeting was discovered, it would be easy to portray her as someone attempting to manipulate a child to serve her own interests. The reunion between Charlotte and Sophie was emotional in ways that neither had fully anticipated. Sophie had missed their daily conversations more than she'd realized. And seeing Charlotte's drawn appearance and obvious stress made the injustice of the situation feel even more acute. Charlotte, meanwhile, was struck by how much older Sophie seemed, as if the events of the past 2 weeks had forced her to mature beyond her years. Their initial awkwardness gave way to the comfortable rapport they'd always shared, but with an underlying current of sadness about the circumstances that had brought them together. Sophie's account of her discoveries was methodical and detailed, revealing an investigative thoroughness that impressed Charlotte despite the seriousness of the situation. The hidden phone, the desperate text messages, the pattern of secretive behavior, and the financial irregularities all painted a clear picture of Mrs. Ashford's involvement in the bracelet's disappearance. Sophie had even managed to photograph some of the text messages, though she hadn't been able to access the phone's financial apps due to additional security measures. More damaging was Sophie's revelation about conversations she'd overheard between her parents in recent days. Mr. Ashford had apparently questioned his wife about the decision not to involve police in the theft investigation, suggesting that he had doubts about the official narrative. Mrs. Ashford's responses had been defensive and evasive, focusing on the need to protect the family's privacy rather than addressing the logical inconsistencies. In the timeline of events, Charlotte listened to Sophie's findings with growing amazement and gratitude, but also with increasing concern about the position the girl was putting herself in by investigating her own mother. The evidence Sophie had gathered was compelling, but it also represented a serious betrayal of family loyalty that could have lasting consequences for her relationship with her parents. Charlotte found herself in the unexpected position of trying to protect Sophie from the potential fallout of her own investigation, even though that investigation was aimed at clearing Charlotte's name. The conversation took a more troubling turn when Sophie revealed the extent of her mother's current instability. Mrs. Ashford had been having what appeared to be panic attacks with increasing frequency, often triggered by phone calls or unexpected visitors. She'd also begun drinking earlier in the day, and Sophie had noticed that some of her mother's prescription medications were being consumed much faster than the labeled directions would suggest. The picture that emerged was of someone under enormous pressure, who was using various substances to cope with stress and anxiety. Sophie's most significant discovery had come the previous evening when she'd witnessed her mother removing additional jewelry from the master bedroom safe, including pieces that Sophie knew her father had given her for their anniversary and birthday celebrations. Mrs. Ashford had handled the items with obvious reluctance, examining each piece carefully before selecting several and placing them in a small velvet bag. The remaining jewelry had been returned to the safe, but the entire process had the feel of someone making difficult choices about which possessions to sacrifice next. Charlotte realized that they were dealing with more than simple theft. They were looking at what appeared to be a gambling addiction or debt crisis that was spiraling out of control. Mrs. Ashford's behavior suggested someone who had moved beyond casual financial irresponsibility into genuine desperation. The missing bracelet was likely just one item in a series of sales aimed at covering mounting debts, and Charlotte's termination had been a convenient way to deflect attention from the real cause of the disappearances. The weight of this knowledge created a dilemma that neither Charlotte nor Sophie had fully anticipated. While clearing Charlotte's name remained the primary goal, they now understood that achieving that goal would likely expose Mrs. Ashford's addiction and financial crises, potentially destroying the Ashford family's reputation and stability. Sophie's loyalty to her mother was in direct conflict with her desire to see justice done for Charlotte, and the emotional toll of this conflict was evident in her increasingly anxious demeanor. Charlotte found herself counseling the 12-year-old about the complexities of family loyalty and personal integrity, a conversation that felt surreal given their reversed positions of power and authority. She emphasized that Sophie's primary responsibility was to her own safety and well-being, and that exposing dangerous behavior was sometimes the most loving thing a family member could do. But she also acknowledged that the consequences of revelation would be significant and potentially irreversible. Their discussion was interrupted by Sophie's phone buzzing with a text message from Mrs. Hartwell, asking about her location and reminding her that she was expected home for dinner preparation. The message served as a stark reminder that their time was limited and that Sophie's absence would soon be noticed and questioned. They agreed to maintain contact through secure messaging apps, but both understood that their next steps would need to be carefully planned to avoid detection. As they prepared to part ways, Sophie made a proposal that caught Charlotte completely off guard. She suggested that they attempt to gather concrete evidence of her mother's financial transactions, possibly by accessing bank records or credit card statements that might show the bracelet's sale. Charlotte's immediate response was to discourage any action that might put Sophie at legal or personal risk. But the girl's determination was evident, and Charlotte realized that Sophie was going to continue investigating regardless of her input. The conversation ended with both parties feeling the weight of their shared knowledge and the complexity of their situation. Charlotte was grateful for Sophie's loyalty and investigative work, but she was also deeply concerned about the girl's safety and the potential consequences of their alliance. Sophie, meanwhile, felt relief at finally having an adult ally who took her seriously. But she was also grappling with the growing realization that clearing Charlotte's name might require destroying her family's stability. Walking back to her apartment through the darkening October evening, Charlotte reflected on how dramatically her situation had changed in the space of a single conversation. What had begun as a desperate attempt to clear her name was evolving into something much more complex and potentially dangerous. She now had access to information that could vindicate her. But using that information responsibly would require careful consideration of its impact on everyone involved, particularly a 12-year-old girl who was already shouldering more responsibility than any child should bear. The next phase of their investigation would require them to move beyond gathering information and into the realm of direct action, a transition that carried significantly higher risks and more serious potential consequences. Charlotte spent the evening researching her options and considering how to proceed in a way that would achieve justice while minimizing harm to Sophie and even, despite everything, to Mrs. Ashford herself. The truth was powerful, but it was also dangerous, and wielding it effectively would require more wisdom and strategy than Charlotte had ever needed to employ in her 23 years of life. Sophie's access to her father's home office proved to be the breakthrough both she and Charlotte had been hoping for, though it came with risks that made Charlotte's stomach churn with anxiety. The 12-year-old had discovered that her father kept digital copies of all household financial records on his personal computer, including credit card statements and bank transactions that he reviewed monthly as part of his meticulous oversight of family expenses. Sophie's plan to access these records during her parents' weekly date night was both ingenious and terrifying in its potential consequences. Charlotte had tried to dissuade Sophie from taking such a direct risk, suggesting instead that they find ways to encourage Mr. Ashford to investigate the financial irregularities himself. But Sophie's response had been pragmatic beyond her years. Her father was too busy with his business empire to notice subtle discrepancies, and her mother was too skilled at managing the household finances to leave obvious traces of her activities. The only way to gather concrete evidence was through direct access to the records that Mrs. Ashford couldn't manipulate or hide. The evening of the planned investigation arrived with an October storm that seemed to mirror the turbulence in both Charlotte's and Sophie's emotional states. Mrs. Impressed Ashford had left for their dinner reservation at precisely 7 o'clock. Following their usual pattern of Friday evening socializing, that typically kept them out until nearly midnight. Sophie had feigned illness earlier in the day to avoid accompanying them to what was supposed to be a family dinner. A deception that had required careful attention to symptoms and timing. Charlotte waited anxiously in her apartment, her phone clutched in her hand as she tried to distract herself with television programs that couldn't hold her attention. The plan was for Sophie to access the financial records, photograph the relevant transactions, and then delete any trace of her computer usage before her parents returned. It was a sophisticated operation for a 12-year-old. But Sophie had demonstrated remarkable technical skills and attention to detail throughout their collaboration. At the mansion, Sophie's hands were trembling as she powered up her father's computer and navigated to the folder containing the family's financial records. The password protection was minimal, relying more on the assumption of privacy within the household than on actual security measures. Her father had always been trusting of his family members, a quality that Sophie now felt guilty about exploiting, even in service of what she believed was a just cause. The credit card statements revealed a pattern of transactions that was even more damaging than Sophie had expected. Mrs. Ashford's gambling activities weren't limited to occasional bets with private bookies. She was also making regular payments to online gambling sites, cash advance services, and what appeared to be loan consolidation companies. The amounts were staggering, often exceeding $10,000 per transaction, and the frequency suggested someone who was gambling compulsively rather than recreationally. More importantly, for Charlotte's situation, the record showed a deposit of $47,000 into Mrs. Ashford's personal account on the day after the bracelet was reported stolen, followed immediately by a withdrawal of $45,000 to an account identified only by a routing number. The timing was too coincidental to be anything other than evidence of the bracelet's sale, and the amount suggested that Mrs. Ashford had sold it significantly below its appraised value, probably to a private buyer who specialized in handling questionable transactions. Sophie's discovery went beyond financial records to include email correspondence that painted an even clearer picture of her mother's desperation. The messages between Mrs. Ashford and Vincent revealed the extent of her gambling debts and the pressure she was under to make regular payments. Vincent's messages had become increasingly threatening over time, progressing from polite payment reminders to explicit threats about the consequences of continued delays. The most chilling discovery was a series of messages in which Mrs. Ashford discussed the staff's situation with Vincent, seeking advice on how to handle the investigation into the missing bracelet. Vincent's responses showed a disturbing familiarity with using household employees as scapegoats, suggesting that Mrs. Ashford wasn't the first of his clients to blame domestic workers for thefts that were actually sales to cover gambling debts. As Sophie photographed each piece of evidence with meticulous care, she felt a growing sense of sadness about what she was uncovering about her mother. The woman she'd always seen as sophisticated and in control was revealed to be struggling with an addiction that had consumed her life and driven her to betray people who trusted her. The financial records showed that Mrs. Ashford's gambling had been escalating for over 2 years, funded initially by her personal allowance, but eventually requiring the liquidation of jewelry, art, and other valuable possessions. Charlotte's phone buzzed with incoming messages as Sophie transmitted the evidence, each image representing another piece of proof that would vindicate Charlotte while simultaneously destroying the Ashford family's stability. Charlotte found herself experiencing conflicted emotions as she reviewed the evidence, relief at finally having concrete proof of her innocence, but also genuine sadness for Mrs. Ashford and concern about the impact this revelation would have on Sophie's relationship with her mother. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. The financial records, email correspondence, and timeline of transactions created a clear narrative that explained not only the missing bracelet, but also Charlotte's wrongful termination. Mrs. Ashford had sold the bracelet to cover gambling debts, then orchestrated Charlotte's dismissal to deflect attention from her own activities. The systematic nature of the deception, including the careful timing of the accusation and the decision to avoid police involvement, showed a level of premeditation that made Charlotte's anger burn fresh and hot. Sophie's investigation had also uncovered evidence of other missing items that hadn't been reported as stolen, including artwork and collectibles that had been quietly removed from the house over the past several months. The pattern suggested that Mrs. Ashford had been systematically liquidating the family's assets to fund her gambling addiction. Using Charlotte's termination as cover for the most recent and most valuable theft, as Sophie completed her evidence gathering and carefully restored the computer to its original state, she felt the weight of what she'd discovered settling into her chest like a physical presence. The information she'd gathered would clear Charlotte's name and restore her reputation. But it would also likely result in her mother's public disgrace and possibly criminal prosecution. The loyalty conflicts that had been troubling Sophie throughout their investigation now felt almost unbearable, as she realized that saving Charlotte meant betraying her own family. Charlotte spent the remainder of the evening organizing the evidence into a coherent narrative that could be presented to appropriate authorities. The documentation was comprehensive enough to support both civil and criminal proceedings against Mrs. Ashford. But Charlotte found herself reluctant to immediately pursue the most aggressive options available to her. Her primary goal had always been clearing her name and restoring her reputation, and she wondered if there might be ways to achieve those objectives without completely destroying Mrs. Ashford's life and marriage. The next morning brought a new complication when Sophie reported that her mother had discovered her own investigation activities. Mrs. Ashford had apparently noticed that someone had accessed her hidden phone, and she'd confronted Sophie directly about whether she'd been snooping around the house. Sophie's denials had been convincing enough to avoid immediate consequences. But Mrs. Ashford's suspicion meant that their window for gathering additional evidence was rapidly closing. The pressure of maintaining their secret collaboration while living under increased scrutiny was taking its toll on Sophie's emotional and physical health. She'd lost weight over the past week, and her school performance was suffering as her attention was consumed by the investigation and its potential consequences. Charlotte realized that they needed to make decisions about how to proceed quickly before the stress of the situation began to seriously impact Sophie's well-being. The evidence they'd gathered was sufficient to clear Charlotte's name, but using it effectively would require careful consideration of timing and approach. Charlotte spent the weekend researching her legal options and considering how to present the information in a way that would achieve justice while minimizing collateral damage. The truth was powerful, but it was also destructive, and wielding it responsibly would require more wisdom and strategy than Charlotte had ever needed to employ in her young life. Monday morning arrived with the crisp clarity that only October in Connecticut could provide, and Charlotte stood outside the ornate gates of the Ashford estate with a manila envelope containing printed copies of all the evidence Sophie had gathered. She'd spent the weekend agonizing over the best approach to use the information, ultimately deciding that a direct confrontation with Mr. Ashford was the most ethical path forward. Her plan was to present the evidence to him privately, allowing him to handle his wife's situation with whatever discretion he felt was appropriate, while also securing the public vindication she needed to restore her reputation. Charlotte's hands were steady as she pressed the intercom button at the gate, though her heart was racing with anticipation of the conversation ahead. Mrs. Hartwell's voice crackled through the speaker, sharp with surprise and disapproval when she recognized Charlotte's voice requesting a meeting with Mr. Ashford. The head housekeeper's initial refusal was expected, but Charlotte's calm insistence that she had important information about household security matters eventually secured her a grudging appointment. Inside the mansion, Sophie was experiencing her own anxiety as she prepared for school. Knowing that Charlotte's visit would likely trigger the final confrontation that they'd been building toward for weeks, she'd barely slept the previous night, alternating between excitement that Charlotte would finally be vindicated and terror about the consequences for her family. Her mother's behavior had become increasingly erratic over the weekend, with mood swings that ranged from manic cheerfulness to deep depression, often triggered by phone calls or text messages. Mr. Ashford received Charlotte in his study, a mahogany-paneled room lined with leather-bound books and technology patents that represented his life's work. His initial demeanor was politely distant, the attitude of a busy executive granting a brief audience to a former employee. He'd been told only that Charlotte claimed to have information about security matters, and he clearly expected a brief conversation about some minor household concern that could be quickly resolved and forgotten. Charlotte's opening words shattered his expectations and transformed the atmosphere in the room completely. Her voice was steady but emotional as she began. "Mr. Ashford, I was wrongfully accused of stealing your wife's diamond bracelet. I have evidence that proves not only my innocence, but also who actually took it and why." The manila envelope she placed on his desk seemed to grow larger and more ominous as the implications of her statement settled into his consciousness. The evidence presentation was methodical and devastating. Charlotte walked Mr. Ashford through each piece of documentation. From the financial records showing the bracelet sale to the email correspondence revealing Mrs. Ashford's gambling addiction and her consultation with Vincent about using household staff as scapegoats. Mr. Ashford's face aged years in the span of minutes as he absorbed the reality of his wife's deception and the scope of her financial problems. The most damaging revelation was the systematic nature of Mrs. Ashford's activities. The evidence showed that Charlotte's termination wasn't an impulsive decision made in a moment of panic, but rather a calculated strategy designed to deflect attention from ongoing theft and fraud. Mrs. Ashford had been planning to use Charlotte as a scapegoat for weeks before the bracelet disappeared, waiting for the right opportunity to execute her plan. Mr. Ashford's initial reaction was denial, followed quickly by anger at Charlotte for violating his family's privacy and manipulating Sophie into gathering information. But as Charlotte calmly addressed each of his objections and pointed out additional details in the evidence, his anger gave way to a horrified recognition of the truth. The financial records were too detailed and comprehensive to be fabricated, and the timeline of events was too precise to be coincidental. The conversation was interrupted by Mrs. Ashford's unexpected return to the house, supposedly from a morning tennis lesson that Mr. Ashford now realized had probably been another meeting with Vincent. Her arrival in the study was initially casual, but her demeanor changed dramatically when she saw Charlotte sitting across from her husband with financial documents spread across the desk. The color drained from her face as she realized that her carefully constructed deception was collapsing in real time. Mrs. Ashford's first instinct was to attack, accusing Charlotte of blackmail and illegal access to private information. But Mr. Ashford's quiet presentation of the evidence silenced her protests and forced her to confront the reality of her exposure. The email messages were particularly damaging, as they showed her own words discussing the staff situation and her plans to use Charlotte's termination as cover for her theft. The confrontation that followed was painful to witness, as years of deception and financial irresponsibility came to light in a single conversation. Mrs. Ashford's gambling addiction had consumed over $200,000 in family assets over the past 2 years, funded by the systematic sale of jewelry, artwork, and collectibles that she'd replaced with high-quality reproductions to delay detection. Her debts to Vincent and other creditors now exceeded $500,000. with interest and penalties accumulating daily. Charlotte found herself in the strange position of being the calmest person in the room as the Ashford family's private drama unfolded around her. Her primary goal remained securing a public acknowledgement of her innocence and a formal apology that would restore her professional reputation. She had no interest in destroying the family or pursuing criminal charges against Mrs. Ashford. But she needed concrete assurance that her name would be cleared and that her ability to find employment would be restored. Mr. Ashford's response to the crisis was swift and decisive, reflecting the executive skills that had built his business empire. He immediately agreed to provide Charlotte with written documentation of her innocence, including a formal letter of recommendation that could be shared with potential employers. He also offered financial compensation for the damage to her reputation and the weeks of unemployment she'd endured as a result of the false accusation. More importantly, for Charlotte's long-term prospects, Mr. Ashford committed to personally contacting the other wealthy families in their social circle to correct the narrative about Charlotte's departure from their household. He understood that his wife's gossip about the theft had damaged Charlotte's reputation throughout the community, and he accepted responsibility for ensuring that the truth was communicated as widely as the original lie had been. The conversation concluded with arrangements for Charlotte's immediate reinstatement. Should she choose to return to her position at the mansion, Mr. Ashford acknowledged that the household had suffered in her absence, and that her dedication and competence had been underappreciated. But Charlotte's response surprised him. She thanked him for the offer, but explained that her experience had taught her the vulnerability of her position as household staff, and she'd decided to pursue other career opportunities that would give her more control over her professional future. As Charlotte prepared to leave the mansion for what she knew would be the final time, Sophie arrived home from school to find her parents in the midst of a crisis that would reshape their family permanently. The 12-year-old's relief at seeing Charlotte vindicated was tempered by her sadness about the pain her investigation had caused her mother and the uncertainty about her family's future stability. The reunion between Charlotte and Sophie was bittersweet, marked by gratitude for their successful collaboration, but also by awareness that their relationship would necessarily change as a result of the circumstances that had brought them together. Sophie had proven herself to be remarkably brave and resourceful, but she was also a child who needed stability and support as her family worked through the consequences of her mother's addiction and deception. Charlotte's departure from the Ashford estate that afternoon felt entirely different from her humiliating dismissal 3 weeks earlier. She carried with her not only the formal documentation of her innocence, but also the knowledge that she'd fought successfully for her own vindication. The experience had been painful and frightening, but it had also revealed strengths and capabilities that she hadn't known she possessed. As the mansion disappeared behind her for the last time, Charlotte felt a sense of closure and empowerment that marked the beginning of a new chapter in her life. The restoration of Charlotte's reputation proceeded with the same methodical efficiency that had characterized Mr. Ashford's business dealings. But the process revealed just how extensively the false accusations had damaged her standing in the domestic service community. Over the following week, Mr. Ashford made personal phone calls to more than 20 families, placement agencies, and professional contacts, each conversation requiring him to acknowledge his wife's deception and take responsibility for the harm that had been caused to an innocent employee. The response from the community was mixed, reflecting the complex social dynamics of wealthy Connecticut society. Some families were genuinely apologetic and eager to make amends, offering Charlotte immediate employment opportunities and expressing regret for their quick judgment. Others remained skeptical, suggesting that the revised story might be an attempt to cover up more complicated family problems, and questioning whether Charlotte could be trusted given her involvement in exposing Mrs. Ashford's private struggles. Charlotte found herself in the unexpected position of having multiple job offers while simultaneously questioning whether she wanted to remain in domestic service at all. The experience of being powerless and vulnerable to false accusations had shown her the inherent risks of working in private households, regardless of how well-intentioned the employers might be. She'd also discovered